Hey, Beth. Do you mind advancing the slides? Okay, I'm sorry. Because Stan's like a wizard behind the curtain. You can drag a chair over there. Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Yeah, I mean, you'll probably be able to tell, but I'll just say next. Okay, we're just signatures, or even the space. Okay. Also works. Okay, are you guys ready to talk about fall gardening? We had a nice tour, and I hope I'm sad for the people at home that aren't going to see this garden, but I brought a few pictures to share. Beth, if you'll advance one. There we go. So this is the heirloom garden here at the History Center. Beth Plutzer and other master gardeners design this garden every year. They take excellent care of it. It's an inspiration. If you haven't visited, you should take a look and just let yourself in anytime. Just come over and look at the garden. And I have, next slide, I have a couple of more pictures just as eye candy for what a garden can look like in its prime. This is a combination of last year's and this year's photographs. Some of people will recognize some of the plants they just saw. It's just lovely. And I think gardens should be functional, but they should also be beautiful. And they are just this garden is a particular inspiration to me. And I've been really proud to work in it with Beth. Next slide. So we're talking tonight about fall gardening, and I'll posit to you that fall is the very best time to garden because we're literally reaping the fruits of our labor. Those of us who vegetable garden or flower garden, we're pulling them in and enjoying them right and left. That said, we are very tired. I am very tired. We've been working through the summer. We're harvesting and cleaning up the garden, and we're preserving our food. And it's really hard to get the motivation to get out there and continue gardening when you're kind of at the end of your gardening season. But I'd like you to push through. It's important to push through and get out there and enjoy the fall weather and set yourself up for really great gardening success next year. It's the most important time to prep your garden. Next slide. So I'll cover just some stars of the fall garden, some fall planting types of plants and tips, a little quick discussion of preserving the harvest, a lot of discussion about how to clean up the garden and why, how to tend your soil for good results, and then a little bit about winter protection, which is kind of the final stage of fall gardening. Next. All right. So I'm a vegetable gardener, and this talk is not exclusively vegetable garden focused, but that is my personal focus and the thing I know the most about. I'm covering other things, but if you have a question, we're going to bring Beth out of the Wizard of Oz curtain to answer it. But the plants that, at least in the vegetable garden, that thrive in the cool fall weather are the stars of the brassicas. And I'm from Alabama originally, and I moved here about 10 years ago. And I could never grow a cabbage or a broccoli or a cauliflower. I could grow collards, but it has been the most fun to grow, and they grow so well here. And you can grow them in the spring, in the early cool spring, and then again in the fall for harvests in late fall. And they include cabbage, broccoli, kale, radish, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kohlrabi. There's so many brassica family members.
And one of the things too about kale and also collards is after you get a freeze, they're much tastier. So it's a really good time to.
When you harvest in the summer, they can be a little bit bitter, but that little kiss of frost, the plant concentrates the sugar in the leaves, and they're much nicer eating. Carrots, you can harvest those until the ground is too solid to pull them, so they can stay in the ground as long as you'd like. Beets, spinach, and chard, they're all kind of in the same family. They do well. And peas, they're a little finicky because it's hard to get a pea to go in the July, August timeframe for harvesting. They're easier to grow in the spring, but a lot of people will have success in the fall. Next. Okay, this is a complex slide because people always ask, what can I plant and when can I plant it? And the truth is you have to learn the formula. You have to know where you live, and you have to know when your frost is predicted, and you have to do a little simple math. And so there's this great website out of Purdue that you can enter your location and get a lot of information about spring frost and fall frost and the average, the earliest, the latest, and then you play a little gamble. So I like to try to give myself a little room. You take the plant that you're planting, and usually the seed packet will tell you days to maturity. And so I'll use broccoli as an example. I think it said 50 to 70 days. So in my case, I would say to be safe, I would say it's going to take me 70 days to harvest this broccoli from when I start it from seed. And so if I want a harvest before freeze, I want to get it started in the summer. So I might plant the seeds indoor July 15th, and that will, in 70 days from July 15th would be, I think I looked it up, September 23rd, give or take, pretend my math is correct. And that's a great time to harvest broccoli. And so give or take a week in there and you're probably pretty safe. It's hard. You can direct sow these. They don't always do as well lately because our summers have been so hot. So it's a little bit of a gamble with plants like broccoli and such that want to bolt if it gets too hot. It's nice to kind of start them indoors and keep them in a cooler area until the later August when it starts to cool down a little bit. But it's easy to do fall planting, provided that you've made room in your garden. You've maybe harvested some things like peas that you pulled out in the spring and you've got a little room in your bed. You can certainly do fall gardening.
You can also go to NOAA and look for the long range forecasts. That's been very helpful for us.
I think it's going to frost in October. It's going to. Sometimes a heavy freeze, not always, but it's definitely going to heavy freeze by November. But I've easily harvested Brussels sprouts into Thanksgiving because they're really hardy. So even after a pretty good freeze, they can be harvested. Okay, next slide. Preserving the harvest. This is just a little bit of show off of things that I've grown over the seasons. And just, it's important, especially if you grow a lot of food. You can't eat all of the food that you harvest, and it's really rewarding to try to find ways to enjoy that food on into the season. And so you have things like winter squash and pumpkins that can be stored in a cool area, and they're good for several months as long as they're not exposed to warm, bright conditions. At the end of the season, I have a picture of all your green tomatoes. You can go out there when you know it's going to frost, and I'll show you later why you definitely want to pick them before it frosts. Bring them in. They're not going to be as stellar as the ones that you grow in the middle of the summer, but they're edible, and it's way better than a grocery store tomato, I promise you. So bring them in, and most of them will ripen eventually. And you can put them in a paper bag with a banana so that ethylene gas will build up, and it kind of hastens the ripening. Drying herbs, you can just dry them in the air in a cool place or a warm place, I'm sorry. You can put them in a dehydrator. I did that for peppers, made ground cayenne peppers. You can obviously can, you can freeze, and you can ferment. And there's other ways to do it, but I do all of them, and I'm actually taking a class right now on food preservation, so I can be a consultant about that, and I'm really excited about it, and I'd love to teach it, but not tonight. Next. I want to give you my most special tip for tomato sauce because tomatoes are my one true passion. This is my beleaguered husband after discovering how many tomatoes I froze. So what I do, because you don't get tomatoes all at once, even if you grow determinants, it's a myth. You can't ever get them at the same time. What is best for me, and a lot of other people swear by this, is to take the core out, maybe put it in 1 or 2 pieces to fit them into gallon freeze bags, and just freeze them, skin and all. Just make sure you take the core out over the season. And then sometime in fall, when you're ready to make sauce and you've rested a little bit, you pull them out and thaw them. When they thaw, they're going to release most of their water. So it'll be a thin tomato juice, very thin. I pour that out. You see my little virgin, I call it what is it? Bloodless Mary is what I call it. So I take that sauce and I reduce it down 2 or 3 times, to concentrate it a little bit. It's delicious. And then I can that sauce for drinks and salad dressings and soup additions. And then you take the wilty, thawed, strained tomatoes, you roast them with onions and garlic, and then press them after that. And you have them, it's already concentrated. You don't have to spend hours and hours and hours boiling it down. And it's delicious. And it's my favorite way to make sauce. Okay, let's move on. What are we going to plant in fall, and why do you want to plant in fall? So the mild temps are the main reason. They're easier on the gardener and they're easier on the plant. When the temps are cool and the soil is warm, the plant focuses a great deal on root development. So it's a great time to get perennials started in the fall. It's a very easy time on the plants. And usually there's enough rainfall in the fall, but if there's not, it's easy to forget. You think of, watering when it's hot, but you still need good moist soil for root development. And that moist soil is also quite insulating. So plants, if we have a harsh winter, if the soil is really dry, they get exposed to much colder temperatures. So make sure you water right up until the ground is freezing in fall. Next. So what are we going to plant? I went over already the cold hardy vegetables that you can plant. It's a great time to plant grass and lawns. Bulbs, most of the spring and summer blooming bulbs are planted in the fall. And a lot of people have trouble with that. It's hard to remember to do it. I personally have struggled, like you get them, you order them, you're on a jag of, oh, I'm going to plant 100 daffodils in the yard, and then you're tired and you forget to do it. So ideally, you should get those bulbs in 4 to 6 weeks before the ground is frozen. But I know from experience and from other gardeners, bulbs are pretty forgiving. So as long as you can still get that hole deep enough, go ahead, don't waste your bulbs. And if you can't get them in the ground, at all, then you can consider forcing them in pots and make a beautiful Christmas situation for yourself. But trees, shrubs, and perennials also really excellent to plant in the fall, and kind of the same rules. So you want to give the roots time before the ground is hard frozen to get a little bit established in the ground. And that's usually 4 to 6 weeks. All right. Little couple of notes on grass. There's a great, and I should say, one, interrupt me with questions. This is super, there's small crowd, super casual, but also everything, almost everything that I'm teaching comes from either the University of Minnesota Extension website or some of the other university websites. I put the addresses here, but if you just go to University of Minnesota or do Master Gardener, you'll get to the main site, and they have such easy searches. You can search anything, and it's a wealth of, so I'm teaching you what I learned from them, so you can go learn from them directly. And I don't grow grass. I have a yard of creeping Charlie. I focus on my vegetable garden, so I'm not professing to have any kind of grass knowledge. But I know that you do, if you're going to seed it, early August to late September, again, to give those roots time to establish before winter. If you're going to do sod, you can go a little later because you've already got a little mat of roots late mid-August to late October. If you want to do dormant seeding, which essentially is scattering the seeds and letting them wake up next spring, so just getting them in place so that as soon as it thaws, the grass will emerge. You can do that on into November. And that's not just for grass. You can scatter most any seed as long as your ground is prepared. Like I do this for poppies. Beth was saying the snapdragon, she, I think, put those seeds out. They'll come up the next spring. And I just want to pitch, we're entering and are experiencing a very rapid climate change. We're experiencing droughts. Water is at a premium. This is a great time. All times are a great time, but especially in fall. Think about some alternatives. You can overseed with bee-friendly lawns. You could think about Prairie Moon has a really good eco grass that is lovely, and it is formulated to be drought resistant. Or you can move into the sedges, which if you've ever looked at a Pennsylvania sedge lawn, it's just sweeping and lovely. It's the most romantic thing I've ever seen. So be thinking about other things other than traditional turf. Next. This is from the site, and it's too small to see, and I'm not going to go over it, but this is the kind of information that you'll find at the Extension website. And they'll give you very clear instructions on planting schedules. Next. Okay, so this is going to be the main bulk of my talk, putting your garden to bed. So what do we do in the fall? These are the less sexy tasks. Spring is the sexy season. You're excited about the blooms, and you've been inside all winter, and it's really easy conceptually to know what to do in spring. You put the plants in the ground and you get excited. Fall is less fun, but it's so important. So as your growing season is ending, you really want to do a good fall cleanup. The reasons: you need to reduce your weed population. It will maintain less disease in your garden, both from disease and insect pests. If you don't have big piles of things that aren't hot compost, you're not providing habitat for rodents and rabbits. If you have untended parts of your garden, they'll set up nests very easily, and you'll just have a really easy time next spring. And so these are just some steps, and I'm not going to go into them because I'm going through all of it, but you want to pull everything you can from the garden, take all your stakes, labels, and cages. If you leave them, it's just a big mess in the winter. So just try to get yourself tidied up so that next spring you might reconsider your layout. I will argue, and Beth will, I think, support me, when you clean out your garden beds and you're pulling your plants, unless you're tilling, it's a really good idea to leave the roots in the ground. So just cut them at the base, leave the roots and all their microbial life associated with the roots in the ground over the winter. It will decompose on its own, and it provides nourishment to the soil. It's less disruptive. So unless it's like a super big rooted thing, like a Brussels sprout, you might want to pull a little bit more of that out. But for the most part, but especially for beans and peas, because those are nitrogen fixing plants. And so they have nodules on their roots that actually are natural fertilizer. So you definitely don't want to pull those out of the ground, leave those plants in place, and they'll be long gone by next spring. Know your hot and cold compost items. We're going to cover compost later. But you want to add compost to your bed. Ideally, you can do it in the spring, but ideally you want to do it in the fall, because when you wake up in the spring and the ground is thawing, you want to get those spring plants in right away. And also you want to make sure that your compost is mature. And just in case your compost isn't finished, putting it down in fall gives it all winter to finish doing its thing, so that when you're ready to plant your plants, it's not going to be still decomposing. Like you to consider a cover crop or mulching, and I'll explain why, and carrying and storing your garden tools. All right, let's go into more detail. Next, Beth. Okay, weed removal. Fall is a great time to do weed removal, especially the first year biennials like thistle. So some plants have a 2-year life cycle, and the first year they're pretty easy to pull. They don't have a very long taproot. They make these little rosettes. Dandelion is another. If you get that out the first year, that plant is gone forever, right? If you let it go to the second year, it's going to form such an extensive root network that even if you pull the plant, you can see it's going to pop up several. And Kelly told me, and I trust her, but the thistle, I think the Canada thistle that grows here and is such a nuisance, up to 6 feet away, you can pull a plant, and up to 6 feet away, it's going to pop up another one. So you're going to be chasing that weed for the rest of your life. So try to catch them early.
And the roots go down 19 feet.
Oh God, 19 feet. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So it's really important. So don't slack on it. When you see these rosettes and it's not something you planted, it's probably a baddie. So go ahead and pull it. But if you don't know what it is, there's a website, there's books on weed identification. It'll show you the weed's life cycle and all the stages so you can identify it. And if you, aside from the first year rosettes, also the weeds that go to seed, I have many that have gotten away from me and they're flowering right now in my yard. I need to go get those before they scatter millions of seed all over my yard. Next. Diseased plants. So this one's a tough one. It's sometimes hard to tell, did a plant die because it's old or did it die because it's diseased? But I encourage you to learn about the diseases that plague your plants and the insect infestations, to try to be a little mindful about what you're pulling and where you're putting it. It's recommended that if something has an insect infestation or is diseased, unless you have a particularly awesome home composting system, and I'll cover that, that you remove it from your yard, because you're going to be spreading. So like right here, I've got a squash vine borer. So if I take those squash vines and they have those little, nasty larvae that have bored into my squash vine, they're going to pupate and become squash vine moths that I have to deal with next year. So it might be a good practice just to burn those. If they're infested with squash bugs, they're going to have life cycle of that bug that you can burn. Plants like that's a peony that has powdery mildew. Those spores will overwinter. So if your compost isn't hot enough and you don't clean up your garden, you're going to be dealing with more powdery mildew than you would have otherwise if you just leave it in your garden. And then I've got a lovely picture of my tomato vines. This is what they're looking like right now. They were gorgeous, but now they are pretty crispy with a lot of blight. I should have pruned it more, but I've been busy. But I definitely am going to get it down before next year, because those brown crispy leaves are full of spores. And I want to sanitize my, with a light bleach solution, sanitize my trellises as well, because they'll hold on to spores. Unfortunately, we can't put plant material. This is a law in Minnesota. We can't put plant material in the trash. And a lot of people don't know that, especially invasive and noxious weeds. They don't want that to be propagated through the trash system. So they recommend that you keep it on your property and compost it. But like I said, if you don't have a big, glorious, hot compost heap, you're not going to get it hot enough to kill those spores or those weed seeds. So I recommend taking it to the county compost facility or burning it. And I'll, next slide, just give a shout out. Oh, where's the compost facility? Maybe go one more. Maybe I've moved that slide in the wrong spot. Huh. Go back. You know I had a compost. Yeah. Oh, back. Think. Huh. Oh, it's later when I do compost. All right. I'm gonna pitch our county compost facility because they have a really great operation and they get hot enough that they can handle your junk that you don't want in your yard again. Okay. So now let's talk about pruning perennials. And I absolutely copied this from the internet. Again, I'm a vegetable gardener, but I wanted to give you an idea of why it matters to get to know what's in your yard. This is not an extensive or an exhaustive list at all. But there are some things like lilacs. That is one that I have in my yard. If you prune lilacs now, if you think your plant is big, you're pruning all the blooms for next year. So those blooms set a few weeks after it bloomed this spring. So when you want to prune lilacs, you do it right after it blooms before it has set the new buds. So just be aware of when your things bloom and when you want to give that a prune. And I'm not.
Hydrangeas are another.
And there's some that you do and you don't, right? Woody ones.
You have to know whether they bloom on new tissue or on established branches.
Yeah, some of them you can cut all the way down to the ground, like the snowball type. And then the panicle hydrangeas, I think the woody ones. And so you only want to trim the old bud or the old spent blooms off of those. And the same thing I think of clematis. There's different clematis types. So you have to look up which kind you have. And sometimes you need to prune in the spring. And worst thing that happens is you lose your bloom. You're not going to kill your plant. You might just miss a season of blooming, but you don't want that.
So prune down to like 6 inches off the ground?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about. So not with lilacs. So lilacs, you prune the size you want it to be. Daylilies, they're going to all the way to the ground. Yeah, you just leave a little bit of those. Yeah. Well, if they're still blooming and you're enjoying them, yes, you want to prune them after they're starting dormancy. So if the flower or if the plants are still green, they're still flowering, they're providing habitat, they're putting energy into their roots. You want to wait until it's cool enough that you can tell that plant is giving up the ghost. And once you see it kind of heading that way, or if it's disease, like my bee balm was gorgeous one day and then it was powdery mildew city the next. And so I just said goodbye to those because I didn't want that to spread. And it'll come back next year. Okay, next. Some perennial care. So when you do prune, and I just sort of alluded to this, when you prune, it's going to stimulate new growth on that plant. So it's not a great idea to prune now because then the plant's going to be busy putting energy into new growth because it thinks it's still the season. Wait till it's settled down and dormant to do that pruning. And especially things like peonies that you're going to cut all the way down to the ground, you don't remember where they are. So permanent markers are a really good garden map. So that you can figure out, I mean, I'm on a lot of Facebook boards for gardeners and it's the funniest thing. And I'm guilty of it too. Like, what is this? And everyone's like taking pictures of things that are emerging because they forgot what they planted or where they planted it. So get you a good permanent marker system out in the garden and then you'll know where things are. Oh, one little tip, slugs are a real problem with hostas. So if you notice that your hosta leaves have a lot of slug damage, those eggs will live in the hosta leaves over winter. So go ahead and clear those leaves and do the same thing that you would with, the other things, burn it or take it to the compost to get those slug eggs out of your garden. Next. Dividing your perennials. So if your perennials are getting overgrown or you just want to kind of aggressively multiply and have a bigger stand of certain things in your yard, fall is almost always the best time. Spring is also good, but things that bloom in the spring or the summer, the bloom quality will suffer if you divide them in the spring. So fall is a really nice time to do it. And I have a hard time. I'm kind of a precious gardener. I'm not really, but if you see someone dividing perennials, you just get in there with a sharp spade and divide it. And they are so tough, but it feels so harsh to me, but that's what you do. And they do just fine. And again, you want to have several weeks, 4 to 6 weeks is still the rule, just like with new plantings. You want those roots to get in the ground good before the ground freezes. And again, continue to water because you want that soil to be good and moist, saturated when winter comes.
But if you're growing ornamental grasses, don't divide them.
Oh,
This
don't.
time they need to be divided mid-August.
Okay, earlier.
latest,
Okay.
Because it takes so long for the roots to get established.
I do not grow ornamental, but I'm going to. I've got a big blue stem. I know it's not that ornamental, but I'm excited about that. That's coming in my yard. All right, what's next? I don't even remember. Oh, we talked about this a little bit during our tour, tinder bulbs. So things where the bulbs will not survive our hard ground frosts. And examples are dahlias, elephant ear, caladium, tuberous begonias. And I personally do dahlias, and these are my photos. So when the plant has had, you want to wait until it's been a hard freeze for these plants and the foliage has died from the frost. You know that that plant is now going into dormancy. So I usually wait another week or so. And I kind of watch the weather because you want to do it while it's kind of dry. It's harder to do when it's muddy. So, you just have to do it before the ground is hard frozen, right? Just wait as long as you can, but not too long, or else you're not going to be able to retrieve them. And you just get out there with a fork or something gentle. You don't want to hack in there with spades because you're going to hack up your tubers. Lift them out of the ground. Oh, I will also say, especially if you're growing multiple varieties like Beth's garden out there, she has so many different dahlias. You have to label them at the base because as soon as it freezes, you won't know. It looks like any other plant, any other dahlia. So if you have a bloom you like, and I have these little labels that I wrap around the base right here so that I always know what's what. Anyway, you bring it inside, you clean it up, and I like to cut them, divide them in fall. Some people like to do it in spring. But one thing I learned last year from the Dahlia Society is to clean them up, get them dry, but not dried. You don't want them shriveled, but you don't want them going in super wet. I do a little hydrogen peroxide to not really sanitize it, but get it a little cleaner than it would be. And I wrap it in saran wrap. And I wrap each tuber in saran wrap and I store them all down in my basement in a very cool, dark area of the basement. You definitely don't want light. They all came, I only had like one out of maybe 50 or 60 that I stored that way do badly. I've tried sawdust and I've tried vermiculite, both of which you have to keep a little bit moist, but not dry. And it's just a little harder to get it right, but the plastic wrap for me works really well. And then you put those back in the soil in the spring and you have the same beautiful plants at no cost. And you have, this was one, believe it or not, one tuber that I put in the ground and it made that many babies. And so I have plenty to share with my friends. Okay, next. This is if you want to, I have a bad experience and good experience with this, but if you have special tender annuals that you really want to grow again next year and you can't find the seeds for, or you just, it's from your grandmother's garden, some reason that you just want to keep that plant alive, you can bring it indoors over winter. A classic example is pepper plants. So some people, because especially with our short growing season, they want to get a jump start on their pepper growth. So they'll take a good pepper plant and they will, not a great picture, let it go dormant, kind of like the dahlias. You let it get exposed to like, not a freeze for peppers, but like 40 degrees when it starts to look kind of sad. Take all the foliage off, cut it down to just a couple of little stumps. I do, and it's recommended that you take all the soil out and you rinse the roots because it has life out there and when it's been out in the garden. And I did overwinter pepper one couple years ago, and I brought aphids and spider mites into my greenhouse, which is in my house. It's a sunroom, so it's contiguous with all my house plants. It was a disaster and I was very naive. I won't do it again because it was so traumatizing for me, but I think you can do it well. And if I were to do it again, I would rinse the soil, I would put new soil on, and I would use a systemic insecticide. I don't use any insecticides in my garden, but for something I'm going to bring into my home and not eat for months and months and months, I would use something to make sure that there's nothing that's going to come into my home. That's just me. And you can also do cuttings and grow them in water. I've done coleus. And the truth is they're going to die anyway. So unless you have an infestation, which was traumatic, there's really nothing to lose. So you could experiment with pulling some things inside. Okay, next. What do we got? How's our time? Okay, we're good. So more on fall cleanup, fallen leaves. So there's a big campaign, leave the leaves as much as you can. So every fall I drive down any neighborhood and you're going to see bags and bags and bags and bags of leaves because it is unsightly when you, especially when you have a lawn that you're proud of, you want to rake the leaves up and bag them and get them out of sight so that your lawn is nice. And also, if you leave the leaves on your lawn, especially oaks and large leaves, they get very matted, and it's not healthy for your grass. So I think, and I shouldn't say it is best practice to leave them in your yard because they mulch, they compost quickly, they provide nutrients right back to the soil. They're an excellent habitat for beneficial insects that you need. And you can mitigate the matting by mulching it. And if you don't have, or not mulching it, shredding it. And I have a little cheap, wasn't much, maybe, I don't know, some little shredder that's you plug in and you shred the leaves and it comes out nice and small. But you can also run over a pile of leaves a bunch of times with your lawnmower to kind of break up the size of the leaves. And then it's excellent mulch and it's excellent insulation over the winter. It's excellent habitat. It just makes me so sad. So I will go around and ask my neighbors, I can't get all of them, but I take many, many bags and I put them in my compost and I use them to insulate. I put several inches of leaves on my beds, even bare beds, and that helps me in two ways. One, I'm providing a lot of nutrients. The ones that do decompose are going to feed my soil, but also it's insulating it and I get a jump start on the year. And I actually grew spinach year before last and had them in these little round raised beds. And usually raised beds aren't, they get colder because they're not deep in the soil. So you wouldn't expect spinach to overwinter, but I had like this much leaves on it and it was kind of a mild winter and I got that same spinach the next spring. So nice insulation. Go ahead.
Take a look at the trees in the yard.
Oh, walnut. Yeah.
And you know, if they're diseased, you don't want to use those leaves.
And also black walnut, that's an exception. So black walnut produces, and I don't remember the chemical, but there's some very
Allelopathic.
Yeah, it causes plants to not grow. So it creates a whole, sunflowers to some extent do this too, but if you compost walnut wood or walnuts or walnut leaves, you're not doing a service to your garden. It's going to be inhibitory. And also if you're getting grass clippings from yourself or your neighbor, if you use herbicides on your grass or your neighbors do, please don't put that in your garden because you'll be very sad the next season. Okay. Oh, and the garden that we just toured, Beth uses shredded leaves almost exclusively out there. It's gorgeous.
And then straw.
And straw.
And not just regular straw that you buy in bales. We learned to use the easy straw mulching, fewer seeds, just so much easier to work with. Makes a better footpath.
They sell it in these bales for maybe not on sale. It's like $9 for a bale that is really compressed. It can go pretty far and it has a tacking agent. It's great for lawns. It's meant for that, for seeding a lawn. So once you spray it after it's in place, it sort of stays together so it doesn't get blown away by the wind. Your hands get weirdly slimy after you put it out, but it's a really great straw. Okay, next slide. What do we got? An appeal to maybe leave all or some of your garden completely unkempt. I've talked about how to clean it up, but the wildlife, especially the insect life, needs some habitat over the winter. We cannot live, our gardens cannot thrive without insects, without pollinators and beneficial insects. So I would encourage you to consider if there is a part of your garden that you can leave the seed heads, leave the stalks. Hollow stalks of flowers and plants are solitary bees will use those to overwinter. They make this nest and they lay eggs, you know, at various stages and they come out in the spring. Leaf litter, the viceroy butterfly. This is its pupa? No, larva. Sorry, it's a bird dropping mimic. And so it just hangs around in dead leaves looking like bird droppings and it overwinters here. So it's not like a monarch that flies away. And so if you clear all and that's just one example, I could give you thousands. If you can't leave the stems, consider something like a bee hotel with a lot of little, and there's lots of instructions on how to make those little habitats. If your garden is super, super tidy and you want something that's more architectural and beautiful, they're neat looking. You want to make sure you build it with wood that's not been treated, and make sure you follow the specifications so that it actually works for you. But I will say, and I think I'm covering it later, but I'll go ahead and tell you, I did this last year with my front garden. I have a flower garden, which I leave a little messier than my vegetable garden. And I thought, that's going to be my habitat. And I didn't really think it through because I was really embarrassed about it the next spring, because you can't just leave it until spring. Like, you have to leave it until late spring. And I had a lot of plants that were coming up, and it was confusing because I was having little seedlings and these big messy stalks. And if I cleared it in spring, it's kind of defeats the purpose because the butterflies haven't emerged yet from them. So think about a place you can leave alone until good late June. And then, so tucked in the back, doesn't need to be your whole garden, but leave a little habitat. All right, next. Oh, so here, nice segue. So I'm going to share some of my horror stories. The year I procrastinated removing the fruiting vines, these are tomatillos, and I had tomatillos and tomatoes, and I grow about 100 tomato plants in my garden, so it's a lot of them. And I was so precious with the tomatoes, and I wanted every single one of them, and I was still getting some, and I was watching, and I gambled wrong, and we had a hard freeze. And cleaning that garden up was disgusting. Like, every fruit turned to mush, and they were gloppy mush all over the garden. And I was so angry at myself. You don't need that extra 5 tomatoes. Just get it done when you know a fruit freeze is coming, or you're going to be really mad. The year I left the front garden as habitat and sorely regretted it. I've already covered that. And then the year I had some health issues, and I didn't clean my fall garden at all. Left it absolutely as it was. And it was the next spring, not only was, I couldn't help it, but let's say I could help it. Let's say I was lazy. The next spring was so hard. I was so enthusiastic, and I wanted to get out there and get my plants in the ground, but it was such a mess. I had to spend most of the early spring cleaning it out. That I was late getting things in, and all my plans for succession planting and all the beauty of it, it just kind of wrecked my mood because it was so foul. And my disease pressure and insect pressure that year was off the charts. Again, I grow so many tomatoes. I have a lot of blight and a lot of leaf spot and powdery mildew on the squash vines, and it was a big difference. So I know it works. I know I still get disease, don't get me wrong, but I get much less of it if I tidy up my garden. And then when it's spring, it is just so nice. You have perfect, soil that's prepared. You put your compost down. All you do is pull back your mulch, and you pop those plants right in as soon as it's ready to go. And I know you're tired. I am tired, but go clean your gardens. You'll be really glad you did. All right, what's next? I don't remember the order of my slides. Oh, just a little nod to tool and container maintenance. I do a terrible job. This is what they say to do. It is not what I do. You should do it. So your tools and all of your hardscape in your yard will harbor those spores and disease and viruses. So clean off the dirt and consider sanitizing them. And a 10% bleach solution is really effective. There are other things you can use, but that's the easiest. And consider sharpening them like a grown-up. I don't do that. You should do it. I don't even know how to sharpen it. Beth, do you know? I bet you sharpen your tools. Yeah. So Beth knows.
My husband.
So you should. And one day I will be so together, and I will sharpen all my things and store them just beautifully and neatly in the garage, not just yeeted under the thing. Anyway, lots of information on the site. You can read about this. Next. Talk about soil just a little bit. And these are just the things I'm going to cover, so we can go ahead and go into the next slide. I very strongly recommend that you do a soil testing at the university. You can get at our extension office, or you can call, and they'll have one, I think, sent to you, right? If you call and ask for a kit, they'll mail one to your home. You fill out a little information about your yard. You take a couple shovelfuls of soil, you send it to them, and they will send you, I don't remember the cost, $35 maybe,
Yeah.
Ish. It's not free, but it's not, it's affordable, and it's worth every penny, because they will tell you what your garden needs, what your soil needs. And healthy soil is more important than anything else you can do for your garden. No matter how good of a gardener you are, if you don't have the right nutrients in your soil or the right composition for drainage of your soil and the right organic matter in your soil, you're not going to have success that you could have. So
That said, though, there's a problem
Oh.
with reading the analysis. And when they
It's a little
give
scientific.
rates, yeah, it's hard to put it into a homeowner's perspective. And I think they're undergoing changes.
Yes, we are here though. If you do that and you've done the YouTube tutorial and you've read the things online and it's still a little bit too much, call them, and I'll have some help numbers at the end. Call the Master Gardeners and we'll help you translate that to practical, what you should actually put down on your soil. Okay, next. Cover crops. So this is something I have never done because I am too stingy. I try to do 3 succession plantings in my vegetable garden. I never leave it. It's always too late to put a cover crop in, but it's a really good idea. And Beth is really good at cover cropping. She did, what was it, buckwheat that you had?
Buckwheat and oats and peas, field
Peas,
peas and radishes.
Radishes. Yeah, so if you can put some, there's some cover crops that are nitrogen fixing, like the peas, and there are some crops, like if you're gardening in heavy clay soil and you want it to be a little more aerated and have more organic matter, radishes are terrific. Those radishes will pierce the soil and then they'll break down in the soil. So there's a lot you can learn on the website, but it really is both a living mulch and a way to keep the soil from eroding and put nutrients back into your soil. So there's not just the life that you see above the soil, all the plants that bloom and grow and provide vegetables, but there's an entire ecosystem of microbial life under the soil that needs those roots, and they want roots at all time. Naked soil is the worst thing a garden could ever have. So cover crop is best, mulch is second best as far as keeping the garden healthy. Next, compost. So here are the bins that you guys saw when we toured the garden. Sylvia built these beautiful bins. Not all of us have some. Mine are made of pallet crates that works, but not nearly as nicely as these guys. It's the most important thing you can do for your soil is to add the organic matter. It's a place to put since we don't have yard waste pickup, if you can just compost on site, it's very handy for cleaning up, provided you have the space for the compost. You don't have to have a fancy system like this. That is really helpful if you want to speed things along and keep it hot. So you have room to turn it over and move it. And as the stages of compost and decomposition are progressing, you kind of progress through the bins. And I'm not going to cover that, but it's a nice system for speedy compost. So getting compost out the same season that you start it. You can just have a pile. You can just do some chicken wire, one big bin, and add your compost. It will be slower, but you'll get compost at the end. So it doesn't have to be that fancy. Next. So the best practices are to have shredded material. So if it's big material, it's not going to break down. You don't want to put a whole squash in your compost. It will break down eventually, but it'll be slow. So if you're wanting,
And you'll have squash growing.
you will. Yeah, because it won't get hot enough. Yeah, in order to have, and I'll go into hot in a minute, but you want a balance of some wet things like squash and green leaves and things that you can just imagine become wet and soupy if you were to let them rot. Those are the greens. And then the browns are things that have already had their moisture pulled. So the leaves, hay, straw, egg cartons, the brown paper bags, shredded newspaper, as long as it doesn't have toxic inks on it. Those are the dries. You can also use wood shavings like the bedding that they sell at Tractor Supply. That's a good dry for some compost. You want to have moist compost. If it's too wet, it's going to smother. You're not going to have oxygen for the things that are happening. But if you don't have,
it smells so bad.
it does. It smells like garbage if it's too wet. If it's too dry, it slows everything down. So you just want to make sure that you've got some moisture in there at all times, and that you're turning it frequently to oxygenate the inner side, and to also, the middle of it's going to be the hot part and the outside is going to be cool. So you want to make sure all the material gets exposed to the hot if you don't want weeds next year.
It's finished when it looks like this. And this is garden gold. It's dark, it's rich. It does not smell gross in any way. It's like rich, wonderful soil. And it's, dark and fine textured. Next. Ideally, you practice hot composting. This is my compost pile when I was doing a good job at it. I'm now a lazy composter, but my husband baked a pot roast in this compost pile. It was so hot. He's very eccentric. He called it a comp roast, and he wrapped it very clear, it was very clearly wrapped, carefully, multiple layers, but we cooked that roast in that compost pile. If it reaches 140 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 weeks, it's considered hot, and that's enough to kill all the pathogens and the weed seeds and overwintering insects. If you can't, and that means all of it. That means that you've turned it, and every part of that compost has touched 140 degrees for many, many days.
And if you buy bagged compost, it's been sterilized to that. It has to be by the industry special. And that's why you don't need to worry about spreading jumping worms, our favorite worms, via the compost.
Yes.
Because sadly, that's not the case for hardwood mulch, but for compost.
Yeah, hardwood mulch will bring things with it. Compost has been, done in industrial scale, so that it will be hot. It's hard to get that scale at home. So be mindful. It's great to compost, but be careful about what you put in, because you're probably not going to get the hot compost, and you may be perpetuating disease or weeds. Next, but there's help, because we have a terrific county composting site. They ask for donations, but ultimately it's a free service. They take yard waste, and then they take that yard waste and they have giant piles, and those piles get very hot, and they make great compost. And yeah, it's going to have, when you go to scoop it, you're going to see some bits of plastic bag and things, because people aren't perfect when they bring their yard waste, but it's good compost, and they test it. I've called them and talked to them personally. They test it for residual herbicides to make sure that, the garden waste that almost certainly came in with herbicides, it's been heat treated enough, and you don't have that to worry about. They also test for jumping worms, and they've not found jumping worms in this compost. So you can compost the good stuff at your house, and you can take the bad stuff to the county and then get compost from them, and everyone's happy. That's my recommendation, and that is what I practice. Okay, next. Okay, this is the very last little bit. Some notes on winter protection. So after you put your garden to bed, you can do a couple other steps to really hunker down your plants for winter, because winter and wildlife can really do a number on the garden. Tender perennials such as roses, lavender, sometimes you can get lavender to overwinter. You can protect them with several inches of mulch. So you can really, sometimes, like, it's a really precious plant, put a cage around it and give it many inches of mulch all along the root ball, and it will help a lot. Protect trees from winds, and I've got a picture of why you want to do that. Burlap wraps for some of those evergreens. I don't have them, but some of them will get that wind burn and lose foliage. So they're wrapped in burlap over the winter just to protect that.
And also, when you're talking about especially evergreens, if you get a heavy snowfall, go out and get that snow
Shake it
off,
off.
because it will break the
Yeah.
limbs.
I'm not good about this. Again, I'm from Alabama, so I just winter here is still a big mystery to me. So I'm parroting back things that I learned at the U of M and through my training here. Like bud caps on young pines. I don't know what that is, but I know it's a thing.
Because I didn't either.
Yeah, but I guess, if it's a short enough pine, the deer can get to the tops and will eat the tops of it, and they sell bud caps for those plants. And then the bark, and that was it's so sad. They'll plant an expensive heirloom apple tree, or just one that they've had even for a couple of years, and maybe the snowfall is a little higher than they expected, and they did the little tube, to protect the bark, but the snowfall got, this far up, and so the rabbits just got above where they covered it. So be aggressive, cover your, because once a tree, the bark is like a really important uh, system of nutrient transport for the tree. And so once you've lost the bark, your tree cannot survive. It cannot regrow the bark. So do protect that sensitive bark from nibbling.
And lawnmowers.
Oh, knocking into them, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and just as an aside, no mulching, even though I've been saying mulch, 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 trees, if you mulch up to the base of the trunk, it'll start having weird root formation and it will grow roots. I don't quite know what happens, but I know that it's very bad for the tree and you can kill your tree this way. So you always want to leave a donut and you want to see, you don't ever want to see ground and straight trunk like that. A tree should always have a nice flare at the base, and that flare should be open and exposed to oxygen. It should know that it's above ground, because if you start covering that with mulch or try to do like a flower garden around your tree, you're going to kill your tree. So that's just a complete aside. Okay, next. That's just a picture. I didn't realize this, but harsh winter winds caused a little fissure in this tree, and that tree's not going to do well the rest of its life. But these little things that you can cover them with, they sell them at the hardware stores, and you just pop them on the tree, or they sell this like ace bandage looking material for larger trees that you can use. Next. This is a picture I stole from some site of a rose garden in a winter climate that otherwise would have a hard time wintering, but you see how aggressive they've been with the straw to keep those roses nice and insulated over the winter. All right, next, I think I've got resources. And again, you can have, if there's a way to get these slides to you, I'm happy to share them, but you can also just go to, University of Minnesota Extension. If you just remember Extension, that'll get you to the master area, and they have a search bar. And I made this entire talk by looking in there. You can find just wealth and wealth and wealth of information there. If they don't have it at the U, you can do really, there's just the internet's it's a wonderful and wrong place. Like there's just so many talking heads on the internet that just spout misinformation. And that's a real tenet of the Master Gardener program, is that we only teach things that are evidence-based and scientifically supported. So we really want you to have success. And if you want to look something up yourself and you're not a Master Gardener, if you just type, and this is like tips for anything, whatever you're Googling, like winter protection, and then you write site equals extension.edu in your search term, your searches will be limited to other extension sites. So University of Iowa, all of the others, outside of Minnesota. And it's just nice. It kind of filters out a lot of the riffraff from the internet. We have a Facebook page. If you just look us up, it's an active, wonderful place and a social place, but we ask each other questions. There are other groups that there's Minnesota Gardeners and Minnesota Fruit and Vegetable Gardeners, not necessarily Master Gardener run, but a nice community. So ask your buddies. Next. We're here, and there's a big gang of us in Olmsted County. We have a website that you can ask your questions. There's a little web form that you write your gardening question, and we volunteer to staff that on a rotational basis. There's also a phone line that you can call. I'm not sure of the hours, but I'm sure it's normal hours. You can't call it in the middle of the night with an emergency, but reasonable hours I'm sure are kept. Next, and if we don't know the answer, we will find it. It's a big enough community. There are enough experts to ask. I'll just also pitch. I've only been in this program, is this my fourth year, third year? I'm kind of new. I'm not, haven't started around the pandemic time. It's been a great experience. I was not that knowledgeable. I loved gardening. I was very enthusiastic and passionate about it. I knew a very small amount about, vegetable gardening. And I thought that maybe it felt a little weird to call myself a master gardener or to try to go into a program. It felt like egotistical. But what I have found, and I know to be true, and Beth will strongly support this, is that none of us know all of it. And collectively, we know a whole lot. And I have learned so much from my colleagues in the program. So if you feel like a learner and you feel like you're not really a master gardener, it's just the name of the program. Come join us. It's a lot of fun. We do really fun community-based service projects. It's fun, and there's an application. It's due by October 1st. There's a course that you take. It's at your own pace, and it's not that hard, and you learn a lot. All right, I think that might be it. That's it. Anything I didn't cover that you'd like to chit chat about before we? I covered a lot. Oh, I garden with you. Yeah.
Well, for 4 years now, and we've always kept the same spot. Well, last year I did get my zucchini and my squash just died all of a sudden, and I just thought, oh, it failed. And
Mhm,
this year again, it came back again.
mhm.
It's a little ugly gray growth thing bugs that are on.
The squash bugs?
Yeah.
So that woman that came out with you, Beth, and talked to us, she said, I said, well, then maybe I should do this plot again. She said, no, do this plot, but treat it. I don't know how to treat it this fall. How do I treat it if I keep that plot?
I'm a bad person to ask because I don't use any, like, I don't know what products are used. I have found, it depends on how large your garden is and how often you go out there, but it takes several days for the eggs to hatch. And squash bugs eggs are very easy to spot. You just lift up the leaves and they lay a big cluster of bright copper eggs. You can take masking tape and just lift it off.
So just be real vigilant.
It's enough. Yeah, I have found that to be successful. I have a harder time with the squash vine borers because they lay single eggs. They're very tiny and sometimes they're under the soil line. They're hard to get. I do hand pick those off also. They eventually win, but I usually, by hand picking them for a while, extend for a couple of weeks. You can start a second one. So my original, the squash that I planted early summer, they've all succumbed. They've gone, but I planted a couple of weeks ago new plants and they're doing well. And the pest pressure is much lower now than it was last month. And so you can just decide that they're temporary plants and go for the next one. But do you know of a product for treating? I know it exists, and they have a couple of rules at the history. They want you to try not to use insecticides out there, but I think probably everyone does. It's a hard place to garden. I have a plot out there, and I have my backyard plot, and it's night and day as far as the disease and pest pressure. So don't beat I abandoned my plot this year. I mean, it was hard year.
And always look under the leaves when you're searching because that's where they are
Yeah,
for the most.
so I probably need to start right away. I mean, because I don't think of it until it's already in there.
Yeah. Just, as long as you're checking a couple times a week, you'll catch them, and just lift every leaf. And the squash bugs, you can find those eggs because they're patches of them. But
And cabbage moss, the same thing.
yeah, so all the things that the green worm is the white cabbage butterfly that eats all the brassicas, every one of them, and they will win. But you can get this BT spray, which is it's not an enzyme, but it's some kind of toxin that is made by this bacteria. It's not harmful to us, but it paralyzes the digestive system of those worms. And so you spray your leaves with this, and you do that like once a month it's like every and that depends on how bad the pressure is, but I do it about once a month and I get a couple of holes, but it's great. Changes everything. You don't get those laced, decimated plants. So, all right. Thanks for coming. Thanks. Enjoy your fall gardening.